Today we're lucky to have with us Bob Froelich and Aaron Palmatier they're both from Bayer Ornamentals. And so I want to welcome them both here. And they are going to be sharing information on actually nursery weed control and container stock. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bob and to Aaron, and take it away, guys.
All right, Tom, thanks a lot. I know this is just after lunch, and I appreciate everybody joining in. And so I think everybody knows me, but obviously Bob Froelich with Bayer Ornamentals, and down here in Columbus, and I know all of you guys. So thanks again for joining. So this most of this is actually a pre-recorded presentation from Dr. Chris Marble, and I'm going to go ahead and let Aaron, our ornamental tech manager, to kind of introduce Chris Marble prior to launching the presentation. But also, as most everybody's probably used to with all these Zoom meetings, because there's probably close to about an hour of information here, and we want to have questions and discussion, but we're going to save that to the end. But if you are able to type it in the chat as far as any questions or comments, that would be great too. So go ahead, Aaron.
All right, you guys can hear me okay?
Yeah, I can.
Excellent. Yeah, so I just wanted to briefly mention a few things about Dr. Marble. So Chris is on faculty at the University of Florida, and he's been just a tremendous resource for the ornamental industry, not only in Florida, but really on a national level, because he's done so much great work looking at weed management. But one of the things about the presentation we're sharing with you today is Chris really started, he's probably he knows the most about indaziflam, the active ingredient in Marengo. He had an opportunity to work with indaziflam when he was working on his PhD at Auburn University with Dr. Charles Gilliam, and who's kind of like really a pioneer when it comes to weed science. And so what we did is we had asked Chris to kind of give an overview of his experience with Marengo or the active ingredient indaziflam. And this is, we don't want you to get the wrong idea that this is a Marengo roadshow, because he does show a lot of work that he's done with Marengo, but more importantly, he does a lot with pre-emergence herbicides and kind of shows how it best fits. And he definitely shows how competitive products would fit in rotation as well. But again, we hope that you find this to be useful, and Bob and I are here to address any questions. As Bob mentioned, this is going to be a recorded presentation from Dr. Marble. So with that, Bob, you can take it away.
Get it back.
Great.
Hi, my name is Chris Marble, and I'm a weed scientist at the University of Florida. My research focuses on improving weed control in nursery crops and landscape plantings. So today I'm going to be presenting on using Marengo and other pre-emergence herbicides and strategies to improve weed control. Indaziflam, which is sold as Marengo, is still a relatively new herbicide for use in the nursery industry, and some people still are not that familiar with it. So I'm going to give you an overview of the herbicide indaziflam, sold as Marengo, and briefly cover some of the major takeaways from about 10 years worth of research that I've done with this particular herbicide and other herbicides. So first up is Marengo use inside in completely enclosed structures like greenhouses, and I had a chance to test Marengo before it was actually labeled for use inside greenhouses. And so here I'm going to talk about that research and what we found, and then also what that means for you as a grower. So this is how we set up our research trials to evaluate Marengo safety inside greenhouses from a volatility perspective. We started with these in-ground gravel beds, and those were treated with Marengo at both a low and a high rate. And then we had these flats of sensitive herbaceous annual and perennials, and then they were immediately placed on top of that treated gravel, and then they were covered with these custom-built, meaning plastic greenhouses. And the plants remained inside those covered houses for several days until we moved them and started taking injury ratings to see if there was any injury to the plants via volatility. This slide shows petunia injury at 30 days after treatment, and you can see up here in treatments 1 and 2 where only the gravel was treated, there was no injury to petunia, and they had the same growth and quality as the non-treated plants, both the non-treated plants that were inside the greenhouses and also outside the greenhouses. So where we saw severe injury was when Marengo was applied over the top of the petunias, which would be expected to see. And in this slide, we see the exact same trend, only with impatiens. We saw similar results with several other species, and there was never any injury to the plants when only the gravel was treated. Like you see up here with the impatiens, no injury when only the gravel was treated. So that indicates that Marengo wasn't causing any injury via volatility. So the take-home message from this work and then other research that we've done with Marengo inside houses is that it's a very good option for weed control on the floors inside greenhouses, which is going to be very important when we don't have a lot of good options in propagation and liner production, which is always a big issue. So right now it's the only herbicide that's labeled for use with crops that are inside the house. But if the crops are outside of the house and the house is empty, we do have other options like SureGuard that could possibly be used and you wait for 24 hours. So a popular tank mix that I've seen some growers use with success is a Finale Marengo combination, and that's going to provide you good pre and post emergence control. I've still had reports of injury from Marengo inside houses, but in all the cases that I'm aware of, when we went and we figured out what was really going on, it was mostly due to drift because the sprayer pressure was too high and the small droplets were. So we've also done a lot of work with Marengo and field production, which is what I'm going to talk about next. So when I was a student at Auburn, we did a lot of safety testing at commercial nurseries, and we looked at Marengo at rates ranging from 7.4 up to almost 30 ounces per acre. And so in most cases, we also include SureGuard as a herbicide standard, and then we also include a non-treated check for weed control purposes. And to evaluate the safety, which was the primary goal of these trials. We were looking at safety of Marengo as a directed application. We evaluate all these herbicides as a directed app, and then they were all combined with glyphosate, a 2% solution, and that was just to control existing vegetation. And so we're going to talk about some of the results, but the Cliff Notes version is that we never saw any injury with Marengo when it was applied as a directed application. And we tested on about 30 different ornamental trees and shrubs over those years. So this slide here is just showing Bosc elm at about 150 days after treatment. And then over here on the picture on the left, you can see where the herbicide application starts and the weed pressure that was observed in the non-treated check, which is these first 3 pictures on the row. And where we had bad or poor weed control, in almost all cases, it was always yellow nutsedge, which Marengo isn't going to control. But if nutsedge were an issue, you could switch to something like Pendant Magnum or Tower, which is going to be a pretty good option for yellow nutsedge control. And this graph gives you an idea of the weed control that we observed, and it shows a percent weed control at 170 days after the first treatment, and then at 180 and 240 days after a second treatment. And so if you look at the blue and the red bars, those are going to represent the labeled rates of Marengo. So those will be realistic rates. And so in both cases, we saw over 80% control for several months after 2 applications. We also saw a very high level of weed control with SureGuard as well, and that's represented by that black line, and SureGuard was tested at a 10 ounce per acre rate, or up on the higher end of that label rate. So for everybody that's growing in the field or wanting to do something to keep weeds down in non-crop areas, both of those herbicides, Marengo or SureGuard, those would be very good options to add into a rotation. They're going to cost more from a chemical standpoint, than just applying glyphosate or another post-emergence herbicide probably, but you're going to reduce the labor costs and then really dramatically reduce the total number of applications that are needed. And then consequently, what I've seen in almost all cases is the overall cost of weed control is going to dramatically decrease when using these pre-emergence herbicides and not just relying only on post-emergence weed control. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is Marengo use in containers, both the granular and the liquid formulation. So we've done about 25 safety experiments over the past 10 years or so and looked at Marengo tolerance on about 150 different plant species. And in these trials, we looked at both formulations of Marengo, used both as an over-the-top and directed applications, and have looked at safety on everything from woody ornamentals to trees to palms to herbaceous perennials and ornamental grasses. Basically, we've looked at safety on a lot of different kinds of plants. To give you an idea of how I and other researchers test herbicides for tolerance, so those plants can go onto those herbicide labels, we usually test them at a 1, 2, and 4 times that highest label rate, and then we apply those treatments twice, about 6 to 8 weeks apart. So for a plant to go actually on the label and for that label to say that it's safe for use, we don't want to see any injury at any of those rates. We don't want any injury or any growth reduction. So in this slide, you can see some crepe myrtles that were tested, and we saw good safety with Marengo and no growth reduction compared with Freehand or Snapshot, which we used as the industry standards in this particular trial. And this story kind of repeats itself with a lot of the woody ornamentals where we don't see much injury with a lot of the granular pre-emergence herbicides. Just another example, here's Bigfoot Clayera. And you can see there's no injury or growth reduction at 2 months after the second treatment with Marengo at those 3 different rates, or with Snapshot or Freehand, which Clayera is listed on those labels. Marengo is usually safe for woodies, but there's several species on the label that are on the do not treat list, like Pennisetum fountain grass. And you can see here at 8 weeks after 1 application, we started to see some injury at those 2 highest rates, 400 and 800 pounds. In comparison with the non-treated control, which is looking very good there. And this is fountain grass at 8 weeks after 2 applications. And so you can see definite injury and death at just about all those rates. And so it is important to reiterate the fact that you need to look at those do not treat lists and all those herbicide labels, because they can cause significant injury if they're applied to those plants on the do not treat lists. And here's muhly grass after 2 applications. And we did see a little growth reduction at that highest 800 pound per acre rate. In a lot of cases, people might observe some injury following a herbicide application, and that might be due to environmental conditions or possibly an over application. And it's just important to remember that calibration is always going to be the most important factor in determining success with any herbicide, because those herbicides are going to work in a narrow range, and they've got to be applied at that rate that they're recommended for them to work effectively. So back to the SC, or the spray applied formulation, we've also evaluated it as a directed application in large container grown trees in addition to the field work. So this slide is just showing Shumard oak at 3 months after following a directed application of Marengo or SureGuard, and we observed no injury or growth reduction, and about 9% of weed control or better with all those treatments. And related to the non-treated check, which we had a lot of weed pressure in this particular trial. So some people use Marengo or possibly another pre-herbicide like SureGuard in non-crop areas and see good results. And so the logical next question is going to be, can it be used over the top? So we've also looked at this on several species of palms and woody ornamentals, which is what we're going to talk about in these next couple of slides. So this is coconut palm at 12 weeks after 1 application of Marengo SC. And these rates range from 9 to 36 fluid ounces, or 1 to 4x the label rate. And then the granular formulation was tested at 2 to 400 pounds per acre, along with Snapshot, which was used as the chemical control. Again, we used that as because Snapshot is very safe. And you can clearly see that we saw significant injury with those over-the-top applications of the liquid formulations, but the granular formulation was safe at up to an 800 pounds per acre rate, in comparison with that non-treated control. Here's cat palm, and here we saw severe injury. So here's a summary of our work with Marengo on palms, where we show the species that we were evaluating and the highest rate that we could apply with either the SC or the G formulation without seeing any injury or growth reduction. So what about woodies? So here's Fashion Azalea, and this picture was taken at 90 days after an over-the-top application with Marengo. But in this particular trial, we looked at lower rates, so 4 to 16 fluid ounces per acre. And in this particular trial with Fashion Azalea, we saw very little injury and then no growth reduction. Here's Knockout Rose, another species that tolerated the application pretty well, and we didn't have any injury or growth reduction with this species either. And then with Loropetalum, we started to see some injury, especially at that high 16 fluid ounces per acre rate, where we started to see significant injury and then some death in some of the plants. And here's Gardenia at 90 days. And again, a little bit of injury in all the treatments, but definitely most severe at that highest rate where we started to kill all the plants. And so this is Ligustrum, and it is a species that's generally pretty sensitive to indaziflam. And so that was pretty evident here where we saw reduced growth and then also really high levels of injury in all the over-the-top treatments ranging from 4 to 16 fluid ounces. And here's Chinese holly at 90 days after treatment. And finally, the Chinese holly, they were killed. Most of the plants were killed at rates as low as 4 fluid ounces per acre when it was applied over the top. So it was definitely hit or miss in terms of which species we could go over the top with. But if someone was choosing to go over the top and do, kind of an off-label application because a lot of these species wouldn't be listed on the label, it would be very important to calibrate very accurately, because you could see how the injury really increased from 4 to 8 to 16 fluid ounces. This summary is set up similarly to the previous summary with the palms, and so this just highlights the species, the woody species, where we saw no injury. Knockout Rose, Blue Rug Juniper, Fashion Azalea, and then the Camellia that we tested all showed good tolerance to over-the-top applications. But all the other species that we tested exhibited at least some minor injury, or in a lot of cases, very severe injury or death. And so it should be pointed out that for most of these species, they have not been evaluated extensively. This is just 1 year's worth of work, and we didn't look at it really that much further. And Marengo is only labeled for use as a directed application. It can be used over the top with certain species that are added to the label now, certain conifers and things like that. So it's going to be best to follow that label and then not go out and spray over the top of all the roses or azaleas just based upon this one particular study where we did see pretty good safety. We need to look at that in more depth and at more different locations before we can really recommend that. So as a summary of the results with the safety trials, the granule has had a pretty good safety profile where it's been safe for use on most woody plants, but it definitely can be injurious to certain woodies, just specific ones here or there, and then most herbaceous perennials. And if I really had to, if I had to compare it to another herbicide, I'd probably say the safety profile is kind of similar to something like Broadstar, which is also another good option on most woody plants. But then some of the herbaceous species and some of the woodies that are kind of notorious for being sensitive, it can injure those. And then for the liquid, we generally saw good safety when it was applied as a directed application, but it's not going to be, it shouldn't be used over the top on most crops. Stick with those species that are listed on the label as an over the top application. For those species that are on the label, using Marengo in a rotation would offer a lot of benefit in terms of giving you another mode of action in a liquid, because that's going to be a big benefit. What we'll talk about in the next few slides when we go into rotations is that with liquids we don't have a lot of modes of action, and so if you can go over the top with Marengo, that does give you a novel mode of action that you're probably not using right now.
Uh, Hopefully everybody can hear me. Can you hear me, Tom?
Good.
Yeah, I just wanted to interrupt here to just kind of give a Marengo update, label update, and Chris Marble was alluding to that, but I've talked about this information for about a year now. So like on the Marengo flow, we now have we increased the number of weeds from 85 to 99 as far as controllable weeds, and then we actually added quite a few more tolerant plants to the label. You can see there was like almost 140 additional plants that we've added to the tolerant plant list. And as Chris said on the presentation, we actually have over the top plant material that you can actually apply Marengo to over the top. And those are mainly arborvitae, spruces, firs, and some pines. So, and also there's fewer restrictions as far as what we always call as the do nots. That's down to 7 from the 20. So, this is the over the top. Those are the plants that we have added. So I can share all this with you, but obviously it's all on the label there as well. So also, I just noticed my little circles. Also, the over the top language, it's all spelled out on the label here. But also, one of the things that our previous label with Marengo didn't have is actually a statement, is like it says there at the second bullet point. If a desired plant is not listed on the label, you can treat several plants at the maximum use rate and evaluate about a couple months later for acceptable tolerance. And then basically the user assumes responsibility for the applications not listed for the plants not listed on the label. So I know that seems like that's a CYA statement, but it is. But also we never had that on the previous label. So if you did do a trial, technically that was off label, but now you can actually do a trial based upon the new label language. Also the G, Marengo G, you can see some additional things that we did there as well, as far as more weeds, more tolerant plants, and fewer restrictions.
So next we're going to talk about efficacy with Indaziflam, and we had about 150 different efficacy trials, and we've really looked at it closely on about 15 different container weed species. So here we're going to talk about it in terms of its longevity and then also its spectrum of control, or how many weeds that Marengo can offer pretty good control of. So in this slide, you can see one of our efficacy trials, and in this particular case, we were looking at split applications versus just one application, which is where the A's and then the A's and the B's come from in all these different treatments. So here I'm showing spurge control with Indaziflam, and the rates that we tested range from 100 to 200 pounds per acre, along with freehand, which we used as a chemical check. And freehand's another herbicide that's very strong on spurge. And this is at 8 weeks after treatment, and we saw no difference in spurge control with Marengo or freehand. Both products were providing virtually 100% control. So these are the same ponds at 14 weeks or 6 weeks later. And spurge started to break through in just about all the treatments, but in this trial, Marengo provided longer spurge control compared with freehand, as you can see here, where you have the freehand ponds and then all of the Indaziflam treatments, whether they be single applications or split applications. And Indaziflam does have a pretty long half-life, just as a herbicide in general, and that means that it's slower to degrade than a lot of other herbicides. And so that's definitely going to be a benefit in terms of the length of control that it's going to provide for some species. And here's Phyllanthus control at 6 weeks. And again, there's no difference at this point between Marengo or freehand, and both of these herbicides would be good options for Phyllanthus because both of them are very effective. And this is at 4 weeks later, the Phyllanthus ponds again at 10 weeks, and both are still providing a pretty high level of control, but Indaziflam did provide a little bit better control at 10 weeks in this trial. So as the time increases, that's when Marengo starts to really outperform. So similar to the spurge, this is showing that the herbicides that have longer half-lives can provide longer weed control than some of the other herbicides. And then here's Eclipta at 10 weeks, and you can clearly see better control with Marengo compared with freehand. And Eclipta is one of the more difficult weeds to control. And in my trials, I've probably seen the most consistent control with Marengo and Broadstar. And Freehand usually performs pretty good on Eclipta, but it just hasn't been as consistent year to year as Marengo or Broadstar probably on Eclipta. And other herbicides that can provide some suppression would be things like the oxaflorphin combinations like OH2 and biathlon, and then some of the azoxybin combinations like Gemini. I've seen decent control from time to time, but just consistently, indaziflam and flumioxazin, which is Marengo or Broadstar, generally provide the best control. So this slide shows the results from a large efficacy trial that we did a few years back, and this trial was sponsored by the Horticulture Research Institute. And here we tested about 25 different pre-emergence herbicides on 15 different container weed species. And this chart is showing the percent control that we achieved with each of those herbicides, and this is averaged over all those 15 different species. And so the bigger the blue bar, basically the more broad spectrum that a herbicide is. And so the herbicides that provided at least 80% control, which is represented by that red line, the ones that provide at least 80% control on average of all those 15 species were Broadstar, Marengo, Marengo G, Sureguard, and then a taint mix of Tower and Pendulum. And so what that's telling us is that those particular herbicides were very broad spectrum, at least on these 15 container weed species. And they can provide, that means that they're going to provide control of many different types of weeds, or at least the 15 species that we tested, they're going to provide, they didn't fail to control any one of those species. So now when a herbicide is broad spectrum, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best herbicide for a particular weed. It just means that it's going to provide at least some control over a wide range of weed species. So let's take Gallery, for example. If you look at Gallery, over the 15 different weed species that we evaluated, it only provided about 40% control. But that was largely due to the fact that we also evaluated several annual grass species, which Gallery is going to provide little to no control, and it needs a taint mix partner for those grasses. So the key though is for not to look at spectrum as the be all and end all, but to look at which herbicides offer the best control of individual species when those species become problematic. So let's still stick with the example of using Gallery again, and if we just looked at Bittercrest, for instance, Gallery would be one of the most, if not the most effective option for that particular weed. Overall, though, what this slide does illustrate is that active ingredients like flumioxazin, which is in Broadstar, and then indaziflam, which is in Marengo, are very broad spectrum and control a lot of different weeds. And in this particular trial, that Marengo SC, that liquid version of indaziflam, provided better control than any of the other herbicides. And so no herbicide, though, is perfect every time. And here I'm showing Bittercrest control from a recent trial in which we were looking at several different rotation options. And so this is after the first application, that rotation. And you can see Marengo offered only a little bit of benefit and control in relation to the non-treated pods in this particular experiment with Bittercrest. And this is at 8 weeks after treatment. And again, here is Spurge, and it was the same story. We saw poor control in Marengo and then also OH2, which I would generally think that both those products were generally good and will provide pretty good control of Spurge. And so this was a small plot research trial, and we knew exactly how much herbicide was applied and how much herbicide was actually in each pot. And all the pots were seeded with it in the same way. Each pot got the same number of seeds. So why did we see a failure here? We never really figured it out for this particular trial, but there's a lot of factors that impact herbicide efficacy. And it could have been the weather, the irrigation, the seeding time, the soil type, many different things. And so I include these slides in here to illustrate the fact that as researchers, and then anybody that's making herbicide recommendations, we can't base those recommendations on one trial or one experiment, but we need several years worth of data to really show what works and what doesn't. And so if you try a new herbicide at your nursery and it's not controlling the weeds that it's supposed to, it might not be the herbicide. There might be something else going on there that's causing that poor control, not just the herbicide itself. I just say that that's a need to illustrate that we don't need to make big decisions based upon only one bad experience. If we have a herbicide failure, try to figure out why that was, if that herbicide generally is going to provide control of that particular weed that it failed on. And so to close out our discussion on Marengo, are the spectrum of control or the number of weeds that it controls or at least suppresses is probably its greatest strength. At least for the weed species that I've tested and that are important in Florida, not including the nut sedges, but it doesn't have really any species that is really weak on in comparison with other herbicides. And that doesn't mean it's the most effective on every weed in all cases. It is the most effective on some, but it does offer control of many different species germinating from seed. And so longevity of Marengo is also going to be a big strength. Just indaziflin in general as a chemical has a long half-life. We have data showing several months of control in the field, and then 10 weeks or more of good control in containers, but that really depends upon the weed species. So for us in Florida, it does provide control of some of our key difficult species like Eclipta, Philanthus, Tassiflower, Doveweed, and with those we don't have a lot of good options. And so when those species are problematic, which would be during the summer, Marengo would provide a good option for those.
Because it leaches out.
So we didn't have time to cover it in this presentation, but indaziflam also provides some early post-emergence control of things like spurge, oxalis, annual bluegrass, and then also artillery weed. And all those after those weeds germinate from seed, before they reach about the 2 to 4 leaf growth stage, where they're about the size of a quarter, we can still get maybe 40 to sometimes even up to 100% control with the pre-emergence application of Marengo, because it does offer some early post-emergence activity. We don't want to try to time it to delay those applications. It needs to be applied to weed-free pots, but if we miss it by a couple weeks, we still should get decent control with it, and then also some other herbicides that offer early post-emergence control. And then another thing that we've seen with the liquid formulation with indaziflam is that it typically does outperform the granular when they're both applied at the same rate. But that's really true for most other herbicides that we've tested, and that's just due to better coverage of the soil with the liquid as opposed to the granular treatments, which those granulars can be dispersed somewhat unevenly in pots at some times. To give you an idea of comparing formulations like I was talking about, here's a chart showing the percent control of 5 different herbicides or combinations of herbicides when applied as either a granular or a spray. And the chart here shows the average control that we saw over 15 different container weeds. And then where I have the yellow asterisks, that's where we saw a significant differences in control, meaning that the spray outperformed the granular. And the herbicides that we saw this with in this particular experiment was dimethylamine P plus pendimethalin. So basically a tower plus pendulum versus a freehand. And then also indaziflam, so Marengo G versus Marengo SC. And then also azoxaban plus prodiamine, which was Gallery plus Barricade or Gemini SC, and then the Gemini G. We've seen this with other herbicides and other experiments as well. There's actually a peer-reviewed research paper that was published several years back where we looked at granular versus spray-applied flumioxazin, so Broadstar versus SureGuard. We didn't see a significant difference in this particular trial, but in the experiment where we looked at spotted spurge, we did see a significant difference where SureGuard outperformed the Broadstar when they were applied at the same rate. And so I'm not trying to discourage anyone from using granular herbicides. They still definitely have their place, and they're going to be the bulk of most people's herbicide programs. They also really offer a lot of benefits in terms of safety. But I just showed this to explain the fact that when I show charts and things like that, and we see often better control with sprays as opposed to granulars, it's often just due to the fact of the formulation, and then better coverage of that container surface can often be achieved with sprays as opposed to granulars. So just to provide you with an overall summary, the key strengths of Marengo are definitely its spectrum of control in terms of how many weeds it can control. Really in that trial that we did where we looked at 15 different species, it didn't really fail to provide, it didn't have a failure with any of those species. The other strength that it has is how long it can provide that control. Just in terms of its longevity, both in the field as a liquid, and and then also in containers as a granular. In terms of weaknesses, crop safety is probably its biggest weakness. It's just simply not going to be the best option for herbaceous perennials and some of our chemically sensitive plants. Some ornamental grasses can be injured by it, but it is going to be a good option for most woody species. And then another issue that I see when I hear reports of poor control of Marengo, and then really any other herbicide, it's often the application or calibration practices. We might hear of a herbicide failure where someone is very upset because the herbicide didn't perform very well. And then we go out and we actually determine that maybe a quarter of the rate was applied. So that's going to, of course, lead to failures. That's not always the case, and herbicides can fail for other reasons, like I showed you in a few slides earlier where we had a failure, and that was applied to a very small area, and it was a very controlled experiment. But at least in the real world, the biggest reason, or the number one reason, where I see poor results with any herbicide is typically application issues. So we've covered a lot of information about Marengo, but that's just one herbicide. It's a good herbicide, good option for your rotation in a lot of cases, or for a lot of people, depending upon the crops that you're growing. But you're not going to be able to control weeds with any one herbicide. And then the uncontrolled weeds that aren't controlled are going to take over and start to wreak havoc. So here we're going to talk about choosing herbicides for your operation, actually putting them into a solid rotation program. And then along with some other non-chemical strategies, that's going to provide you with a good integrated weed management program. And that's what we want to build. We want to build a program. We don't want to just pick herbicides. We want to combine those herbicides with some other integrated practices like sanitation, frequent hand weeding, and then build a good program where we can have success throughout the entire year. And so that's what we're going to talk about now. So what is a rotation? What is a herbicide rotation? What do I mean when I say that? I describe herbicide rotations as planned, but flexible, changeable, depending upon the situation. They have to be flexible schedules of herbicide treatments. And these are going to be based upon the season and the weed species that are problematic each season. It's also got to be based upon crop tolerance, because we can't apply a herbicide that's going to injure the crop. And then it's also going to be based upon the annual limits. With every herbicide, we only get so many applications per year with each of those herbicides, and so we have to stay within those annual limits. And lastly, the rotation is basically going to be based upon you, your nursery, your weeds, your crops. I'm going to go over some examples of rotations, but these are just examples, and they might not, and actually they probably wouldn't work in all nurseries, because your crops, your weeds, these herbicide rotations might not be a fit at all. But my goal is to give you a brief introduction on how to build a rotation for yourself. So what encompasses a good rotation? So number one, a good rotation first has to be safe on the crops that you're going to be using it on. And this is going to be based upon the herbicide labels, or possibly even testing out the herbicides yourself. You might want to do a couple small scale trials to see if the herbicides are safe for your plants, if your plants aren't on a particular label or on a lot of labels. And so once you know what is safe, the rotation needs to be effective on those target weeds when that herbicide is applied. And we're going to talk about this in depth in the next couple of slides, and really how to do that and pick herbicides at different times of the year. Number three, we want to try and avoid sequential or back-to-back applications. And this can't always be avoided with some crops where we don't have a lot of good herbicide options for safety reasons, crop tolerance reasons. But we want to try to do that and rotate the best we can. Because we've seen with a lot of herbicides, back-to-backs can lead to a greater chance of injury, and they can also result in worse weed control. And that's just because of the fact that if a herbicide is not effective for a particular weed, and then that particular herbicide is applied back-to-back or over a long period of time, that weed that is not affected or is not controlled by that herbicide has a longer time period to be able to take over and do more damage, since there's not another mode of action that's used for a long period of time, that weed has a big chance to take over. And so it's also important to rotate through different modes of action, but we don't want to just rotate for the sake of rotation. We want those herbicides to still be effective, and I think we can do that. I think we can figure out options where we can use a herbicide that's at least partially effective and control those weeds when those weeds are problematic. And lastly, we want to stay within the annual limits for each herbicide. All the herbicides are going to have annual limits that we can't exceed those. So like, for example, with biathlon, the only label rate is 100 pounds per acre. And we get 200 pounds per year, so we get 2 applications. So we need to figure out which time, if we're going to use biathlon, we need to figure out what times of the year to apply those 2 applications to get the best bang for our buck. With Gemini SC, for example, we can apply it at rates ranging from 38 to 87 fluid ounces per acre. So we would get either 1 high application at 87, or we could possibly get 2 low to mid-range applications depending upon the rate that we win at. And then the same would be true for something like Snapshot. We get 600 pounds per year, so we could apply up to 3 applications at that highest label rate, which is 200 pounds. So you figure out how many applications you get with each herbicide, and then you go in and you look at your crops and your weeds and when different weeds are problematic, and then what weeds that herbicide is effective on, and figure out when you want to use those applications that you have. So here's a slide that just shows you all the options that you have in terms of herbicides, and they're going to be color coded in this chart by mode of action. And so if you look here and you look at the different colors, we have 5 different modes of action to choose from in nursery crops, or at least containers. In field crops, there's also Simazine, and that could be used in non-crop areas and things like that, and that will be an additional mode of action. But in this chart, I show the herbicide, the mode of action group, and then also the general types of weeds that herbicides control. And in most cases, our herbicides are going to control combinations of broadleaves and grassy weeds. And in cases where we don't have that spectrum of control, we often have these combinations, which are represented by the 2 colors on this chart. We also have things like dimethylamine P and metolachlor, or Tower and Pendant Magnum, and those are going to give us some suppression of things like yellow nutsedge. We don't get that with a lot of those other herbicides. So here's the same information, just broken down by sprayable and granular herbicides. And you can see that we have a lot more options with the granulars as opposed to the sprays. And that's at least when you're talking about over-the-top options for most plants. If we were talking about over-the-top of, say, conifers, we would also have things like SureGuard and Moringa that we could use. So sprays are usually less expensive, both in terms of chemical and labor costs. So they're a big advantage, and I've already talked about the fact that sometimes you can get better weed control with sprays, but a big disadvantage of those is that you have a lot fewer options. And so it's going to be much more difficult to build a good rotation with just those sprayable herbicides. But the idea with these charts is that you could use them to help you build your rotation, rotating through different modes of action, or basically on these charts the different colors. So to select herbicides to rotate, you first need to identify and figure out what your worst weed is each season, or around the time that you're going to make your herbicide applications. And after that, you figure out what the secondary weeds are. So in most cases, the worst weed in the warm season is going to be spurge, and in the cool season it's going to be bittercress. At the same time, spurge and bittercress are issues, so the warmer the cool season. There's also going to be some secondary species that are also problematic. And so when you're picking your herbicides, your first priority has to be something that's going to be effective on that worst weed. That's the most important. You have to control that one, or you'll just have weed control failures. You're usually going to have several options for that worst weed, though. So like for bittercress, for example, there'll be several herbicides that can control bittercress. So what we want to do is we want to pick something that's going to control bittercress, but it's also going to have some control of those secondary weeds that are a problem at the same time bittercress is a problem. We do the same thing in the warm season. And so here's what that would look like. If we could choose Forte, Marengo, Freehand, if those were all safe to the crops. And that would be a pretty good warm season, or it would provide pretty good spectrum of control for those warm season weeds. So for those three weeds, we have a lot of options that work on all three of those very well. We already use Forte, Freehand, and Marengo during the warm season, so let's pull those out as options. And then we could choose from Ronstar, Broadstar, Biathlon, or OH2, and then also the isoxaben containing products like Gemini, Fortress, and Snapshot. So all those would be potential options and would give us very good control of that particular spectrum. So potential option, we could go with Ronstar, which is a group 14, followed by Biathlon, which is a group 3 plus 14, and then Snapshot, a group 3 plus 21. And they give us pretty good control of those cool season weeds. In this case, we did repeat modes of action back to back, but we didn't repeat any herbicides back to back. And then we repeated that group 3. So we repeated 2 group 3s, prodiamine, and then trifluoroline back to back. And then just as a side note, it's going to be very difficult not to repeat groups 3 or groups 14. So our dinitroalanine herbicides, or our group 14, our PPO herbicides like flumioxazin, oxaflorphin, and oxadiazone. Those 2 modes of action are many different pre-emergence herbicides, and that combination is very popular because it is very effective on broadleaf and grassy weeds. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's going to be very difficult to not repeat those 2 groups. So only as a potential solution, you could use things like Freehand, Tower, Marengo, and then Broadstar, Forte, our flumioxazin containing products during the summer, because those are good on spurge and then some other warm season weeds like Calypta, doveweed, and others. But it really just depends upon the weed spectrum that you have during the summer. The isoxaben containing products like Fortress, Gemini, and Gallery plus Barricade, or something like Snapshot, those are very strong on bittercress, and then a lot of those cool season weeds as well, especially those cool season grasses. So those could potentially be used during bittercress season. There's a lot of other herbicides like Pendulum, Barricade, Ronstar, Dimension, and those could really be used, whenever you need those, depending upon the goal. But they also work pretty well as tank mixes, and then they also could be used for crop safety purposes. Like Dimension, for example, commonly used in turfgrass, also a great option for weed control in ornamental grasses and containers. The oxaflorphin products like OH2, Biathlon, Route, those are going to control a pretty broad spectrum number of weeds, and those could really be used in either season. They're going to be good options at potting too, so that's something to keep in mind is your potting schedules. Those oxaflorphin containing products are good at potting, and then because some of those other herbicides, you might want to wait until later in the rotation when those plants are a little bit more established before you apply those. So those oxaflorphin containing products could be used earlier in the rotation when those plants were younger. And this is just a general guideline though, and many different herbicide options might work in different seasons or different times. It's just really going to depend upon your nursery and your unique situation. So putting it all together, here's an example of a year-long rotation where you're staying within annual application limits and also controlling key weeds when they're going to be problematic. And in this scenario, I show those in the yellow, highlighted yellow boxes. So here I'll list several options that could be used for the weed species in question, and then what was chosen as the herbicide in blue font. So we start with Freehand, then we go to Marengo, and then we choose Broadstar or Forte, one of our flumioxazin containing products. We follow that by Marengo, and then Biathlon, and then Gemini G, getting into the cooler time of the year to be a strong bittercress product. So this would allow for a pretty good control of the weed spectrum that I'm showing here on this particular slide, and it might work depending upon the crop mix, but that would really be dependent upon this particular species that are being grown. And again, I need to stress the fact that this is just an example, and it's probably going to need to be modified for your nursery. So the next question I'm often asked when I'm talking about rotations is application interval, or how long to wait in between herbicide applications. And this again is going to be nursery dependent. And I've seen people make an application every 6 weeks. And I've also seen good control with only 4 applications per year. So basically like a 12-week schedule if great sanitation practices are followed. This slide shows the average control that we observed on bittercress, crabgrass, Eclipta, Philanthus following first, second, and third applications. In this trial, we were looking at 9 different herbicide rotations. And so what I'm showing here on this slide is the control that we achieved after each application, represented by the blue, orange, and gray bars, which are showing the first, second, and third application, or the weed control that we achieved after the first, second, and third application for each of those weed species that we tested. And so if weed pressure is high, like it was in this particular trial, because we seeded the weeds, so we put a lot of seeds on these pots, a shorter interval is going to improve control. Because if a herbicide is applied every 6 to 8 weeks, there's going to be some of that herbicide left over from the previous application by the time the next one is made. So if you apply at week 1, and then you go back and you apply 6 weeks later, week 7, some of that herbicide from week 1 is still going to be in those pots. Not much to do much, depending upon the herbicide that you used, but there's still going to be some there that's going to provide some control of weeds, especially if those weeds are very sensitive to that active ingredient. So what that can do is potentially, by shortening that application window, potentially over time, you can see the weed control improve, like you see in the chart with the 6 to 8 week interval, where the control increases over time with many of these weed species. You take Philanthus, for example. We saw improved control from the first to the third application. The opposite was true for the 10 to 12 week interval. We were looking at the same rotations, but if we waited until 10 to 12 weeks to harvest those weeds and then go back out and reapply, all those weeds were able to go to seed, and there was a lot more weed pressure there. And so the control actually decreased over time because the herbicide applications were spaced so far apart. And in this case, while we were seeding the pots, there was not any sanitation practices that were followed. So we've already covered Marengo, and then we've also looked at using it and then a bunch of other herbicides in rotations and actually building a rotation program. So it's going to be important to remember that the greats practice the basics. And so in the weed control world, the basics are things like calibration, sanitation, and then also using non-chemical controls where they're going to be needed, like in those sensitive crops. We don't want those sensitive crops where we can't use a lot of herbicides to serve as inoculum for the rest of the nursery. And so here we're going to talk about how to improve control in those other areas where maybe we don't have a lot of herbicide options and we can't build a great weed control program in terms of rotation. So with any herbicide, and especially with granulars, the biggest challenge is usually going to be application and calibration. And this chart shows a survey I did when I went out to different nurseries and I measured their actual application rates. And in this case, the target rate was 200 pounds per acre. And that's represented by the green line on this slide here. And the rates that were actually applied, which we measured by putting catch cups throughout the production block, they range from about a quarter of the rate to over 3 times the rate of the goal. So this is, of course, going to cause a lot of issues. No herbicide is going to work outside of those recommended rates that are listed on the label, and that's going to really throw things off if they're applied, at a quarter rate. If too much is applied, it's going to cost a lot of extra money in chemicals. And then also if too little is applied, it could cost even more money because labor costs for the hand weeding are going to be needed. And so what I would encourage everyone to do is really make calibration the #1 priority when using herbicides and then other pesticides as well. But really focus on making sure that that right rate is applied, whether you're using sprays or granulars. There's a lot of different ways that people are applying those. In a lot of cases, people aren't getting the control that they could really get. They're not realizing their full potential of these herbicides because they're not being applied at the most proper rate. And so I'll just encourage everyone to just take some time, make an initial time investment up front to really focus on calibration and application, because I think you're going to really see a lot of great results going forward if you haven't been doing that to begin with. So next is sanitation, and that is very important. And if you start to see weeds right after plants are potted up and they're right after the herbicide is applied, so you apply a herbicide, then you immediately go out a couple days later and you see some weeds popping up, looking to see where the weeds are coming from might be a clue as to where those weeds originated, and if the herbicide failed or if it's just a sanitation issue. Are the weeds coming up right by the liner? That might be an issue in the propagation house, so the liners were full of weed seed. Was it coming up on the edge of the pots? If those pots were reused, it could be that those pots just weren't cleaned and there was some weed seed that got stuck on that container. A lot of times if it's coming up in the middle of the container like this, and the herbicide was applied, it could be a timing issue, it could be a rate issue, it could be a herbicide failure. But you need to go through and investigate that. But a lot of times when they're right by the liner and then also on the edge of the container, wasn't really a herbicide issue, it was more of a sanitation issue. And so 3 of the most common weeds to look for in propagation houses or in liners are liverwort, oxalis, and bittercrest. These are the ones that I see most commonly. Liverwort can spread by spores, and then oxalis and bittercrest have seeds that will explode when they're ripe. And so a small problem with any one of these 3 species can quickly become a very big problem. And so keeping liners clean is going to prevent that from happening. And here's some examples of weedy shade in greenhouses. One of the big issues in these places are weeds on the floor, which they're going to quickly get into those actual ornamentals up on tables or benches. And if the weeds are on the floor, or if the plants are on the floor, the weeds are definitely going to get into those plants very quickly. So in these areas, using a post herbicide is a good option to kill those existing weeds. And then you could use a pre-emergence herbicide like Marengo, and that's going to work. It could be used under the benches. If the house was empty, you would have a lot more options to work with, depending upon how long the house was going to stay empty. But focusing on sanitation in these areas, especially in liner production and where you're holding liners, where you can't use herbicides actually in the plants, in the pots, focusing on sanitation using herbicides around those plants on the ground is going to be a big help. So hand weeding is no fun, but it's going to be a critical part of that sanitation process. And I had the opportunity of working with 2 other weed researchers, weed scientists, Joe Neal and Jeff Durr, on a trial, and we wanted to see how hand weeding frequency affected overall labor costs. And so how we had this set up was we had separate groups or blocks of plants, several hundred plants in each block, and they were all treated with herbicides, different herbicides. And half of those plants were weeded every 2 weeks, and then half were weeded every 8 weeks. The only difference between those was the weeding frequency. And so every 8 weeks, we would retreat with herbicides, pull the weeds, weigh the weeds, and we recorded the time that it took to hand weed throughout the trial. So here's a photo at 16 weeks, so right before the second herbicide application. And you can see in the pots that were weeded every 2 weeks, they're almost completely clean, no weeds in those pots, while the 8-week pots were full of weeds, a lot of spurge and purslane in this particular nursery. So now you're going to say, of course, weeding every 2 weeks is going to be a lot better because that's 4 times the weeding, 4 times the labor costs. People are going to say 2 weeks, of course, is better. I would do that, but it's going to be cost prohibitive to do that because it takes so much more time. But that's not really the case. So here's some charts showing the weed biomass and the cost per acre to hand weed those pots. By weeding every 2 weeks, we reduce total weed biomass by about 70%, and then we reduce weeding costs, so the labor costs for the men that were out actually weeding the pots, we reduce that by 65% on average. When we did these trials in North Carolina and Virginia, their numbers were similar. Overall, it was about a 45 to 50% decrease in labor costs. So how is that possible? How is weeding that much more frequently, you're able to reduce those costs by that much? Well, since we weeded so frequently, it didn't take much time at all to actually go through and weed. Those people that were out there weeding, they were able to go through those blocks very quickly. That's because when the weeds did break through that herbicide, they never had a chance to go to seed. And so when we weeded every 2 weeks. On the other hand, when we delayed weeding and we just weeded right before that herbicide application was reapplied at 8 weeks, those weeds that broke through were able to go to seed. And there was a much more weed pressure overall. And then all that weed pressure really increased the total time that we need to hand weed. If you're interested in more on this and then how to go through and weed these pots on a more frequent basis, how to train the growers or the people that are out there, the hand weeding crews, in terms of what size weeds to leave, what size weeds to pull, I would encourage you to read Frequent Hand Weeding Saves Money. You can Google that, do a web search for Frequent Hand Weeding Saves Money. It's by Barker and Neal. Came out in 2016. It's on the North Carolina State Extension website. So finally, we're going to talk about some non-chemical methods. And so for plants that are sensitive to herbicides, mulches are going to work pretty well for weed control, which is what we're going to talk about here. Just a little bit of information on mulches. In recent years, parboiled rice hulls have probably been the most popular mulch. They've become more and more popular. There are now even machines that are going to blow rice hulls onto the plant, so application is easy actually out in the field. Rice hulls work pretty good at controlling weeds, and that's because they dry out fast. And so when the weed seeds germinate on top, or they land on top of that mulch layer, they can't germinate because they don't have enough moisture there. And for good control, something like rice hulls can be applied about 1/4 of an inch, while things like bark and shredded wood, they usually need to be applied at 1/2 inch to 1 inch just to get good surface coverage of that entire container. And just about any type of mulch is going to work, but you just want to pick one that drains quickly so that it dries out fast after irrigation or rainfall. And in the photo here, you can see almost 100% bittercress control with 1/2 inch and then also with a 1 inch of wood chips in comparison with a pot with no mulch, and they were all seeded with bittercress. And so mulches are going to work for weed control. They're going to be a very good option when you can't use herbicide. The downside is going to be the cost. It is going to be more expensive, at least initially. And then the big disadvantage is that if the pot blows over, you just lost your mulch, and that can lead to issues. Also, here's a chart showing reductions in labor costs and then the weed weight with different types of mulch, and then a single application of a herbicide over a 4-month time period. And so one mulch application is going to outperform a single herbicide application like you see here, with pine bark, hardwood, and rice hulls, which provided a 70 to 80% reduction in hand weeding, while the one herbicide application only provided a 40 to 60% reduction. And where mulches make sense are when you can't use herbicides, and then also they make sense on longer term crops, because mulches are more expensive than herbicides, but on those longer term crops, you have a longer period of time to make a return on that initial mulch investment, because you can reduce or eliminate many herbicide applications with one mulch application. So if you had a very fast term crop, it might not be cost effective to use mulch because you might be only applying herbicide 1 or 2 times to that fast growing plant. So in closing, I think the keys to success for weed control is first focus on sanitation and reducing weed pressure in all areas. And then when using herbicides, be sure to rotate and then spend some time up front developing a solid herbicide rotation program, picking the best herbicide options for your particular situation. Don't go by what I said here, but go by the method I use to develop those rotations. And in cases where you can't use herbicides, those non-chemical methods are going to be a good option, and they can save a lot of money compared with hand weeding. So I want to thank you for your time and for listening, and I hope some of this information you found it helpful. If you have any questions about this presentation or about weed control in general, please feel free to email me or call me at any time. at the email address and numbers listed here. If I don't know the answer, I probably know someone that can help you with it, and I'd be more than happy to help you in any way that you can. Thank you again, and have a great day.
All right, everybody. I know we were just at an hour there, so I just wanted to break before I asked Tom for if there's any questions. I just want to point out a couple of things. I mean, we do have an online digital solutions guide that I know you don't have time to look at the website and all that stuff right now, but that's something that I could provide to Tom and Kathy later on. Just a couple of websites, and then I think maybe some of you, or if not all of you, may have heard me talk about this, but we actually have a pest identification guide that is a pocket guide. It's like laminated paper, and it's all in Spanish. So we do have this available in print. If you're interested and you haven't got any from me yet, just reach out and I can send however many you would like, and I can get them to you. So this has been a really great, useful guide for a lot of folks, and something that's been actually requested from us to put together. So that is it.